You're listening to Breakpoint This Week, where we're talking about the top stories of the week from a Christian worldview. Today, we're going to talk about the aftermath of Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton and how Christians grapple with the problem of natural evil. We're also going to talk about some good news in the case against Jack Phillips, the Colorado baker who's been pressured for years to make custom cakes that violate his religious conscience. So we have a lot to get to today. We're so glad you're with us. Please stick around. Welcome to Breakpoint This Week. From the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, I'm Maria Baer, alongside John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center. Well, John, this morning, another hurricane ripped through the southeast. Of course, last week we were talking about the aftermath of Hurricane Helene. This week, it's Hurricane Milton. I've heard some reports that in some areas it wasn't as bad as expected, but it also sounds like the Florida government in particular did a really good job of warning people ahead of time and that a lot of people were able to evacuate. I know there was a lot of traffic coming out of there. It just seemed like a really, really scary situation. And what I was reading too this morning is that Milton intensified very quickly. So it went from like a Category 1 storm to a Category 5 storm in 24 hours, which is unbelievable. So I'm sure in the coming days, we're going to find out more about the extent of the damage and hopefully the loss of life is minimal. But it's been a wild week. But I wanted to talk with you about this because, yesterday I heard a story on NPR was covering this storm. And not only is every story framed, every story about the weather is going to be framed about climate change, but they have a new drumbeat, at least I think it's new over there, that every time they use the word climate change now, they have to qualify it with human caused. So, Florida is dealing with this because of human caused climate change or human worsened climate change or whatever, which in the moment feels like such a distraction. But I suppose if you believed that that was the case, that it's worth talking about. But it's hard for me to hear that and take the reporting seriously. Do you have that same reaction?
Well, look, it's first of all, unfortunately, that sort of talk, minimizes what people are actually going through on the ground. And this is 2 straight weeks we've had this conversation. It's absolutely brutal. And you hear words kind of tacked on to these events and these stories. And that's really what I think. And I guess at one level, I've heard them more with this pair than I've heard them in the past. There's been more conspiracy thrown around and tacked onto these storms, and it's happened on opposite ends of the spectrum. So you have a sitting legislator, U.S. Congresswoman who actually suggested that weather is controlled, as if that's something that we can do, and then of course the constant drumbeat was that this is made worse by human caused climate change. And there's just so many ideas smuggled in both of those, takes, so many ideas. And, I just want to start and say, and then you also hear words like unprecedented, which almost is never true whenever you hear unprecedented. In fact, Governor DeSantis actually responded, to those claims. This was a storm that just ramped up in a hurry in an unexpected way. And then it landed as a Category 3, which has a, potentially devastating impact. There was also predictions of a storm surge that no one had seen because of this kind of broadside. I remember just a few years ago, there was this same kind of language, predictions of this storm surge that was going to hit the same area, Tampa, Fort Myers. And, some places got hit very, very hard, but it wasn't what was predicted. Praise God. I think that we can say that with this. Praise God, it wasn't as bad as was predicted. A lot of people, fled that typically wouldn't evacuate during a hurricane. And I think there was this kind of impression that Florida was going to be destroyed, the whole state, because if you went to the Weather Channel, you saw the potential impact zone and it was enormous. And praise God, again, it wasn't as bad as predicted. And yet there's real suffering that people are going through today. And, one of the risks is that suffering is going to somehow distract attention from the needed response in Western North Carolina, which is just absolutely devastating. They will still be finding bodies for a while there because of just the topography. When you say it was unprecedented for that area. It was unexpected. Not unprecedented though in the history of hurricanes. There have been hurricanes. And we talked about that last week where, I remember as a kid going back in the mountains of West Virginia, very similar landscape as Western North Carolina, hundreds of miles from the coast, and the impact of a hurricane there bringing, flooding that, people just couldn't imagine. And it led to a lot of lost lives and so on. Now, here's where I want to kind of, I think, tag this and maybe give us some pegs to hang on to here. Because when you say that, as has been said by a number of conspiracy-minded people on the right, that and not a lot. I mean, I first of all, I think that sometimes you have a kind of a really loud voice from a very few, particularly because of the power of social media to amplify this. But start arguing that we have this ability to control the weather, and including weather events like this. You're making the same mistake as those who argue for human-caused climate change, fundamentally. And that is misunderstanding who actually owns the world. From a biblical worldview, listen, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, period. From a biblical worldview, in the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. This is his world. This is a world that has been inflicted and infected by sin and brokenness, but it is not out of the control of the creator. It's just not. Let's jump to human-caused climate change. Again, there's so much in that just phrase there that you need to understand. First, and by you, I don't mean you, because I know you understand it. But
I'm sorry.
No. I mean, but like, first of all, that climate change is happening. And I think that the data points to that the climate is changing and that this is not unprecedented. The climate changes a lot. And we know this. Many of us are old enough to remember fears of global freezing that were back in the late 70s, early 80s. And so I think that there is evidence that the climate is changing. The second assumption is that it's human caused, that it's changes in human behavior, in carbon emissions. And that sort of data is highly debated, and it should be hotly debated. Because it's not clear that it is human action that is causing this. There's so many factors that come into play here that it's hard to, point to any one cause. Now, it may be the adage that it's not one thing, it's a whole lot of things. But then the third thing is that it's catastrophic. And when climate changes, it's catastrophic for some and beneficial for others. And, that's the nature of the world that we live in. And yet, if the world is a creation, and this is huge, if the world is a creation from God, then it is likely that God, who created the world and also created it good, didn't create it on the verge of disaster at all moments in time. And yet you have to understand that the secular, naturalist, neo-Darwinian story, that's the built-in assumption about the way the universe and especially life has moved forward, which is we shouldn't be here anyway. We're only here by a series of kind of like, once in a kabillion accidents, that this happened to happen and this happened to happen. It's that one line from, Stephen Jay Gould's book. We're here because our group of ancestors from Africa had a peculiar fin anatomy that could transform into legs for terrestrial creatures, because the earth never froze entirely during the ice age, and because a small and tenuous species arising in Africa 250,000 years ago has managed to survive somehow by hook and by crook. I mean, that's his description of the likelihood that we would be here, right? In other words, we shouldn't. I think Richard Dawkins is on record as saying if this whole thing had to do it all over again, there's no chance, that the appearance that the world was made for humans is an illusion, and a facade. So look, if you bring in that assumption, then you got to remember there's nothing superintending, and certainly no one superintending the flow of history, especially the flow of human history. And one little thing we do could mess the whole thing up. It could, bring the whole thing over the edge of the precipice that we've been dangling over since our very existence began. And that's a different thing then a world that has a creator, that has a mind, a purpose, is loving, created humans in his image, because now you have this kind of resiliency that's been built in, not just to people, but to the creation itself. And you also have his superintending hand over, the flow of everything in the created order. And to give too much credit to the human ability to mess up God's plan, that's the mistake on both sides of these kind of, I think, dual conspiracies. And I've heard a lot of that this time. More, I guess one of the reasons I want to talk about this is that it just seems that there's more of this than in past times. And I get it. I mean, part of it is again, 2 weeks in a row here, we're talking about these devastating effects of these weather events, and people have died, and we're alarmed. And I get that. But it is a myopic view, and it's loaded with assumptions about the universe itself and about who controls, whose world this really is.
Yeah. I think it is, it's also gotten worse, like our assumptions of power and control over natural things has probably ramped up because of how much mastery we at least feel like we have over things like technology. I mean, yesterday, Elon Musk debuted, this self-driving van, right? That is probably going to change everything. But this is how it works, though, right? The more we see these kinds of advances, the easier it gets for us to sort of accept this delusion that we actually are able to master things that we actually can't, like nature and whatever else. And then when we suddenly can't, and this makes me think of so many Bible stories where, especially in the Old Testament, the people turn away from God, and God typically does something to remind them that they're not in charge. And that is, sometimes it's disastrous, but it also is a great mercy, right? Because he's poking holes through the facade. I have a book that I've been working through with my oldest daughter. It's Lee Strobel wrote The Case for Christ, right? Well, he has a book called The Case for Faith, and it's for kids. And the book literally opens with a description of Hurricane Katrina. And it's like, so when this happens, and it just struck me this week too, thinking, this is my daughter's 8. This is a book for her. It's been really helpful and really cool to have these conversations. But this is still a problem that we're all dealing with now. We see a disaster, and it's understandable when something sad or scary happens. We tend to think it's more comforting to assume that this was something we could control or that we did control. Because even if it's something bad, then at least we could have somebody to blame. And then at least we could say, we should do this different next time so that we can stop this from happening again. It's much more, it feels much more fragile and vulnerable to say, these things happen. We don't know always when or where or how, and we're kind of at its mercy. And it's just not our role to be able to do something about it. We're not used to that feeling anymore.
Well, this isn't new. This isn't even as recent as Elon Musk and self-driving cars. You're talking about something that has been changing for hundreds of years since the scientific revolution started to shift from understanding the world to exerting control over the world. And humans do have a remarkable level of control over the world that animals do not. I mean, this is part of the creation story as well. We have an ability to steward. We have an ability to make worlds out of the world, to build. I mean, you just go to New York City and it's hard to, and you see kind of the dominance of what, that land once was. And you think, wow, we have really controlled this plot of land.
We produce so much garbage. I can't believe how much garbage we produce.
That's the first thing that comes to mind when you walk the streets on certain days. No, but Jacques Ellul talked about this in his book, The Technological Society, is that with the growth of science and technology, there's this view that we can control the world through technique. And Craig Gay, a scholar at Regent College in Vancouver, put all this together in a remarkable book. It's still one of the more shaping books for me in the last 25 years, called The Way of the Modern World. And he talks about that modernism, one of the results of kind of the secularization of the Western world is this, this instinct that or this feeling of control, that we control things that we really don't. And that's also where anxiety comes from. And, Rod Dreher in his Substack this morning actually talks about an article about kind of the high levels of anxiety, something that we've talked about. Of course, you got Jonathan Haidt's The Anxious Generation talking about this, that really this illusion of control and anxiety, go hand in hand. And then it just gets magnified on a global level when you've got a few voices talking to everyone. It's funny that Soren Kierkegaard, Chuck Colson used to quote this all the time, talked about, he goes, wrote, if ever there was this device where a few people could talk to everyone all at once, we'd have to immediately destroy it because it would create so much chaos. And of course, he was, presciently talking about the television or other means of mass communication. So you have all of these kind of ways of complicating the issue, right? I mean, you think about, I think Governor DeSantis rattled off 5 or 6 or
all
7 hurricanes that he knew had greater
from the 1800s, right?
Right, and the challenge of living in a world that we do not control has been at the root of a lot of questioning of God. Many people look back to Voltaire's work on the Lisbon earthquake, just a devastating critique of the fact that not only is there no God, and we know this because not only the Lisbon earthquake it came on a Sunday morning when everyone was in church. And so, when everyone is in church, that more people died because they weren't outside, I mean, it was a profound critique of the problem of what's called the problem of evil and suffering. And, I think a lot of times the conspiratorial thinking of our day is another way of trying to do the same thing, make explanations of these physical events. And there is this kind of incongruity. I was thinking about this last night. My oldest daughter, who is in college, in a state more north of us. I don't know if you knew this, but the Northern Lights came down pretty far into the U.S. last night.
Cool.
So she took these crazy, beautiful pictures with her phone. And you think, this is the world we live in, where we are kind of simultaneously wowed by its beauty and devastated, by the potential chaos and catastrophe that it can bring. And so you have to look at that story and say, what best explains the design, the intricacy, the beauty, the wonder, the wow, particularly that which brings along with it no survivability advantage, with the devastation. And sometimes, my guess is that the clouds that brought the storms that devastated Florida also brought some incredible sunsets for others. And how do you hold those two things together? So you have to have an explanation of reality that explains both the profound goodness in the world, the beauty of the world, the fact that it is seemingly, as many people have noted, made for humans. We shouldn't, there are no other planets like this. And yet at the same time, as one of our former colleagues would say, we live at the mercy of nature and or at the permission of nature, and they can, who can rescind that permission at any moment in any place. And, that's the things we hold together here, and we're not in control. That is a feature. I do think, to your point, I'll say this, that you go back 500, 600, 700 years, you even go back to kind of what Voltaire's writing about the Lisbon earthquake. There's no illusion of control in any of these takes. While they're still trying to make sense of the world around, there's no illusion of control there. This is a modern phenomenon.
For sure. Yeah, which makes sense. There's a beautiful song by Nicole Nordeman, Christian singer, who she wrote about the song afterwards, that she knew a woman whose baby had a heart, something happened to this woman's baby, and she ended up donating the baby's heart to another family who had a baby who needed a heart. And if that's not a perfect picture of what you're talking about with the clouds, I mean, one family's utter disaster, like life-ending disaster, is another family's, the saving of their baby's life, and that's really hard to hold. And the only thing I want to say, or maybe amend to what you said, is that I agree, our worldview has to be big enough for the reality that these things happen, but I don't think it has to be complete. Like, I don't feel the pressure to sit down with my 8-year-old and explain perfectly why these things happen. The closest I can get to a full explanation is God is in control, and we know that all things work together for the good of those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. Like, we might not be able to finish the math equation now, but part of having faith in God and his goodness together is that this will have been worth it, that our rejoicing in heaven will have been made better. And I don't know how that math works out, but I just choose to have faith that that's the truth. And that doesn't mean these things aren't horrible to see and to suffer. But there's a difference when you're a person suffering with hope as opposed to suffering without it. And that's as close as we can get.
Maybe. I think that is a good place to get to. And those are absolutely essentials. As someone who's had the next conversation with my daughters.
As they got older. Yes, please tell me.
I mean, look, I want you to know that the work that has been done and trying to make sense of the suffering around us, first of all, tells us a lot about the type of creatures we are, because animals don't sit around and ask why. Humans sit around and ask why. That has to be explained. And that can't be explained by the evolutionary process, by an added adaptability function on top of another. And in light of that, look, the struggling with evil and suffering is answered in two ways by Christians. Number one, there has been remarkable apologetic work done on this, to the extent where I think that the fact that every body thinks about it, struggles with it, and all different worldviews and philosophies have to provide answers because they have to explain the world. And Christianity actually has the best answer on the market. This isn't a liability. Actually, it's hard and it's a long journey. But there are wonderful things to understand about the human condition and especially about God in going down that rabbit hole. And it is a rabbit hole and it is hard. And I'd recommend the book Evil and the Cross, which is a little technical, a little academic, certainly not for kids to read, but something that you can go through, because the Christian answer is not just found in the creation chapter of the story or the fall chapter of the story, although those are important parts of the journey. But that redemption chapter of the story is remarkable, and nobody else. And you're pointing to some of those conclusions and quoting Paul, and because that's where he lands. But there is a lot to be learned, and it's not that all the, as my former Bible prof would say, it's not that all the theological socks are tucked neatly into the suitcase. There's plenty of them hanging out. It's not that you have an explanation for everything. It's a mistake. As if you remember back in Katrina days, where some Christian leaders came out and said, this is exactly what God is doing, and here who's he's punishing. That's not the answer. So I'm not pretending that there is a full solution to the problem of evil, but the Christian resolution holds together the things that no other worldview can hold. And that's really profound. And then the second way that Christians answer this is how we suffer. I had an extended conversation with the world expert on this week. I had the blessing as part of our
Tada.
Lighthouse. Of course. Yeah. I mean, I've introduced that whole series by saying, and I can't think of anyone better to talk to us about whatever it is. And then I got to this week and I was like, okay, we're going to talk about how to suffer. Literally, there is no one else on the planet better who can point us to this than Joni, Eareckson, Tada. And of course, she delivered. And it was profound. And I guess I was just reminded, I'm an apologetics, kind of nerd. I'm a worldview junkie. I've studied, I like this journey in a way that is more nerdy than a whole lot of other people who I think need to go down, the kind of the intellectual look at some of these things. But listen, I was thinking the whole time, you remember when Mother Teresa spoke at the National Prayer Breakfast and President Clinton, and she went after abortion, like just powerfully. It's one of the great moments, one of the great speeches ever, actually. And there's President Clinton, who's advancing abortion rights at a degree we've never seen until now, which we've seen well beyond. But, he didn't know what to say because she basically had shamed him. And he stood up and said, it's really hard to argue with a life that is so well lived. And a Slick Willie moment, to be sure, but he's right. I mean, what do you say to this life? And Joni is the same way. But when Christians live faithfully, I've been waiting for years for this film, The 21 Martyrs, talking about those who suffered at the hands of ISIS terrorists on the beach there in Syria. You can't argue with these things when you see the helpers scurrying around Western North Carolina, and the ones doing it the best are the followers of Jesus, and that's just the consistent narrative. How do you argue with that when you see a woman who has been subject to a wheelchair for over 50 years point people consistently over and over and over and over to God? That stuff has to be reckoned with. That's a life that has to be reckoned with, and I do think we've kind of been largely protected from the kind. When you talk about Jack Phillips, which we're going to talk about in the next segment, and how he has dealt with the pain and the mistreatment. Suffering comes in various degrees. How Christians suffer is an unbelievable apologetic in a world, and we ought not make the same mistake as the world around us. And say that we're somehow in control, that suffering somehow can be avoided or mitigated. These things are up to the Lord, and the God of all the earth, as Abraham reminded God in his negotiations about Sodom, the God of all the earth will do what is right, and ultimately he did that in Christ Jesus. And that rabbit hole goes deeper. That's all I want to say. I said it in a lot of words, but that's what I want to say. That rabbit hole goes deeper, and it's such a meaningful journey to take personally, but also with your kids.
Yeah. John, I do want to talk about what you mentioned in that last segment about the case against Jack Phillips. So mercifully, this week there was some tremendous news in his case, which, cases at this point. But this latest case that was brought by this activist lawyer who, as soon as the case about the wedding cake was finished, this lawyer called Jack's Masterpiece Cake Shop in Colorado and requested a cake specifically to celebrate a so-called gender transition. And it was going to be a blue and a pink. I don't even know what the whole thing was. It was obviously a ploy. And Jack said no. And so this lawyer sued. And this week, the Colorado Supreme Court threw out the case essentially on procedural grounds. So this case is over. There's nobody to appeal to. The Colorado Supreme Court is the highest in the land. And this was a dispute over Colorado law. So from what I understand from the Alliance Defending Freedom, who have been defending Jack now for 12 years, this is the end of at least this case. And I heard an interview with Jack this week on The World and Everything in It, and he was just sitting in his office in the back of the cake shop while customers are coming in and ordering cakes, and he's still doing his thing. But this is really, really good news.
It's great news. It isn't a settling of the issue. That's what needs to be clear. The court chose not to address the complaint or the merits or the issues of speech or religion or anything like that. This is a technicality in a sense. It's procedural, as you said. So maybe that's a better way to say it than technicality. And it does end this case, but it does not settle the matter. There will be another challenge to another person, maybe to Jack, God forbid. And I say that because there's a couple things that people need to remember. Number one is this was a 12-year ordeal, 12 years. That ordeal included false accusations. It included people leaving Google reviews, compromising his business, accusing him of having cockroaches in his cakes and all of those other things. If you ever go there, it's just hateful and malicious and everything else. In full disclosure, I left a disclosure on Google review for the Scardina law firm, which is where Autumn Scardina, Jack's accuser, comes from. But I didn't.
John, you and I are the same person. I would have done the exact same.
I didn't accuse him of something. But here's the difference: I didn't accuse him of doing something he didn't do. I just said, I've never done business with this law firm, but you need to know this is what this law firm is allowing, and this is what this particular lawyer is doing. And what he did was target Jack for years. He did not randomly. I mean, this narrative continually needs to be corrected that Jack turns away customers that he doesn't like. He served the initial customers in the first Masterpiece Cakeshop case, a gay couple who had been quote unquote married in another state and was asking for a cake to celebrate their wedding. And he offered to serve them, but just not custom design a cake to offer a message that he doesn't believe in. And when Artem Skardina, and this isn't unusual for the T part of the acronym, to hijack other movements. It's a remarkable thing to watch the transgender movement. There is a good bit of just kind of complete self-absorption here, where Autumn wanted to make this about him. And so immediately called Jack, not randomly, didn't just walk in the store, and asked for a cake. And, initially there was agreement, a pink cake and a blue icing, or vice versa, whichever way it was. And until Autumn articulately said, this is what this is for.
Yeah.
And now it becomes a message. It becomes support of something that Jack doesn't agree with. Like Halloween. He doesn't make Halloween cakes either, by the way. Or cakes celebrating divorces, or raunchy cakes for, bachelorette parties or bachelor party. He doesn't do any of this.
Mm-hmm.
And that began an ordeal in which Autumn Skardina has asked for hundreds of cakes, or dozens of cakes, maybe is more accurate. Some, Satan smoking a joint. I mean, just all kinds of looking for something that would stick in the accusation. And then turns around in the lawsuit. And I was there at the courthouse this past year where this attorney claimed to be harmed and to have his feelings hurt. Sorry, I want to be really clear with the pronouns here, because this is a trans-identifying individual that just went after Jack relentlessly. This 12-year journey for Jack included death threats to him and his family, to the store, loss of business. And I'm just going to tell you, if you've never been to Masterpiece Cakeshop, as you said, he's still there doing his thing. It's really good stuff. Really, really good stuff. So go there if you swing by Denver and order something. I'm really glad it's over. But, here's the headline of the story. It really is. And I've come to believe, as important as these developments are, as glad as I am that this ordeal is at least over for a while, hopefully forever for him. He's paid his dues. He's done his time, kind of thing. The headline is two things. Number one is the procedure, the process is the punishment, as ADF has said over and over and over. That's true for Jack. So he gets the outcome, but this has been 12 years of being mistreated, maligned. And by the way, first the state went after him, and then the state allowed a private citizen to go after him. So you have to think too that the process involves that as America becomes more and more divided state by state on these big moral issues, that the state actually becomes an aggressor. And we've talked about that in terms of the life issue, where in Massachusetts going after pregnancy resource centers, in Colorado going after somebody firebombs a pregnancy resource center, and suddenly the investigative process is hampered and sad, and doesn't actually ever get to a resolution. And that's a way that the state is allowing bad things to happen, if you ask me. The other headline of this story, and I think it's even better and it's most important, and you mentioned this in Jack's interview, and I would tell people to go listen to that on The World and Everything in It. Or if you have a chance to, hear Jack speak. Jack is a remarkable individual. He has become a model of what it means to stick to your guns, not live by lies, and still love others with the heart of Christ. I mean, his joy, the fact that when he hears that someone has actually come to follow Christ because of being inspired by his story, he just absolutely lights up. This is what this is all about for him now. It's not about winning for him anymore. It's about how God is using his ordeal to show himself to others. It is incredible. It is an incredible thing to watch. And on the courthouse steps, it was so remarkable. I can't pretend that I'm anywhere near being able to do this. I can't even handle the TSA. But what I saw in those two press conferences was, first of all, Jack talking about and his posture, his joy, Real joy, not the joy that we're hearing about from political campaigns, the real joy that he is showing. And then how much that contrasted with the very next press conference with his accuser and the narcissism and, the self-pity, the fabricated persecution. It was just, the contrast was so stark. And, when we talk about, which we did in the last, segment about what it means to suffer well, I'm not going to compare Jack's suffering with the suffering of our brothers and sisters in northern Nigeria, for example. Or, it's hard to compare anything with what Joni Eareckson Tada has endured for so long. But how we go through what we go through, what God allows. What does Joni say? God allows what he hates to accomplish what he loves, or something like that. And Jack is such an example of that. I told another interview this week. I was on with our friend Chris Brooks on the Moody Network. Like, he's a different person. When Christ promises, you quoted this verse, to use this suffering in order to make us more like him. Like, Jack is more like Jesus now than he was 12 years ago. And I don't want to wish that. I tell him all the time, like, I'd never wish what you have gone through on anybody else. But man, it's remarkable to see how God's using it. And his face lights up because that's what he wants. It's great. To me, it's crazy because I don't understand it. I'm not that guy. And I look at it and go, praise God for fulfilling his promise to Jack this way. And it's beautiful. It's beautiful. It's something that needs to be talked about more. And, you see the Christians just flock to Western North Carolina, organize, deliver, Samaritan's Purse doing its thing like it always does. And you just see Christians being Christians. And of course, that's the theme of our year really here is what we need now is for the church to be the church. And that means courageous and unwavering like Jack. And that also means, trusting in the Lord through these ordeals like Jack. It's really remarkable. So, I'm grateful for this reprieve from my friend. I hope it's permanent. This isn't it. This isn't settled.
I think the point that you made about the procedure being the punishment is really important. The Holy Post podcast this week, which is a difficult podcast to recommend, but they put out a little explainer video about whether religious liberty is really being threatened in the United States. And their answer was conclusively, no, it is not under threat at all. And the reason is because all of the recent cases that you could classify as religious liberty cases have been decided in favor of Christianity in the past, 10 years. And I think that's really naive for several reasons. I also think it's just a little dishonest, but this is a good example of why. I mean, that would be like saying, if I received death threats for 10 years, but nobody ever actually made good on the threat, then I wasn't suffering or really under threat or at risk or anything. That's just not how this works. And what Jack has gone through has put him, I think, in physical danger, and his family and his workers. And that's not nothing. And, the fact that these kinds of lawsuits, which would have been unthinkable, nobody could have even dreamt them up in the 70s, or the 80s. The fact that these are so almost commonplace at this point, or the threat of them is an important "you are here" moment, as you like to say. This is a real thing that's happening. And I'm with you. I doubt that we know this decision isn't settled. I do think that the court probably saw the decision last year in 303 Creative and hopefully took some pointers from that, kind of saw because that was a big, big decision that I hope settled a lot of these questions. I'm sure people are still going to continue to bring challenges, but it's going to continue.
I think you're right. I think they did. But you wouldn't know it from the decision, right? I mean, this court bailed. And look, this should have been dismissed a long time ago. The initial judge shouldn't have let this case ever go. That certainly you should not be allowed as a private citizen to harass another private citizen for a decade. To your point of the strength of religious liberty in America, it is strong, and it has way more to do with the strength of our founding documents and the strength of the American way of doing things than it does with kind of, trusting that there are no challenges today. Freedom has to be preserved. Or it is vulnerable. When freedom becomes license it becomes, it undermines itself. That's the cultural reality. And so, the reason that these decisions have come out the way they have, first of all, the process is the punishment. Let's remember that. And we have strong documents. These things are clear. These things should have never happened. And the editorial review in the National and National Review this week about Jack's case, I think said it better than anybody has so far. And it is and I think it's in direct conflict with this take that you mentioned, because you celebrate that it's over for a friend. That's what I'm doing. You don't celebrate that this was allowed to happen for this long.
Right.
That's a crazy take in my mind.
Yeah, agreed. John, I want to talk now about a report that's come out with some hard numbers that have been up for discussion for several years now. I think it's only been, you can probably count on one hand, the number of years that hospitals have really been going after this sort of transgender ideology, especially when it comes to minors. I think you and I, one of the first stories I wrote with you when I started at the Colson Center was about how there was this explosion in the number of hospitals that were opening gender clinics, right? That are, treating kids with gender dysphoria, but treating them instead of psychologically with hormones and surgeries, God forbid. There's a new report from a group of researchers called Stop the Harm about the numbers here. And the numbers are, even for, I think, you and I, who've been talking about this for years, shocking. So I want to just rattle off a few of them here. Nearly 14,000 minors have undergone surgeries to reshape their bodies between 2019 and 2023, generating nearly $120 million in revenue, presumably for hospitals and doctors. 13,994 children received so-called transgender treatments. 5,700 sex change operations, which of course is a oxymoron. That's not something that's possible, but some kind of change to a healthy child's physical body, were carried out on children. 62,000 hormone and puberty blocking prescriptions were written for 8,500 pediatric patients. And again, at least somewhere around $120 million in revenue for these. Do you think that this is going to shock people? Do you think people will accept these numbers?
Miriam Grossman, who was on a Breakpoint forum at the beginning of the year when we started to talk about how the tide is changing on kind of where the culture is on this issue, as far as we can tell, and more people are yelling stop. And Dr. Grossman has been at the forefront of that. She called this a nuclear bomb. And by the way, I've just figured out whether it's stop the harm or do no harm. The Washington Stand article, we were just debating this offline, but do no harm is the group. The database, the collection of research is called Stop the Harm. It's the Stop the Harm database. So, and it's produced by this, but it really is a remarkable collection of data. And it's important on a number of reasons. First, it identifies that, yes, this is happening, and it's especially happened at a particular group of hospitals. And they list what they call the dirty dozen here. And this is documenting those who have done this, what is wrongly named gender-affirming care, which goes between puberty blockers to actually hormone injections to, surgical interventions as you described it. And, so the harm really here has been concentrated in a lot of ways, but they list here, the dirty dozen hospitals, other states where so-called gender affirming care for minors has taken place, and then also the states that have age limits on so-called gender affirming care. Now, listen, what that means in terms of age limits is typically, minors, is drawing this line between minors, but we still don't let 19 and 20-year-olds self-diagnose. We still don't let we don't let 30-year-olds self-diagnose and then self-medicate. And that's really the process here that is happening, where somebody goes in and says, I'm struggling with so on, such and such. And a lot of times the psychological comorbidities, which are high among this population group, are ignored. And, the care is so-called care is pushed forward. And so this is just about minors. And as you said, 14,000 in this, 4-year period. One of the really, really important things to understand about this is that we were told for years that this isn't happening. This isn't happening. This isn't happening. This isn't happening. It's not what's happening. It is what's happening. We now have the testimony, firsthand testimony of so-called detransitioners who were either in this age demographic or right around that age demographic going and basically saying, this is what I told them. This is what they said. And within, one appointment or 2 appointments, I was already on, puberty blockers. And of course, now we also know something else that we were told wrong about, which is puberty blockers. They only pause. It's a pause button and you can unpause at any moment. No, it does cause permanent damage. You can't just pause puberty and expect everything to be okay. You certainly can't do hormone injections and expect everything to just pick up if somebody changes their mind. Oh, and we were told that this is who they really are. And yet we know too, as the data has come back, that the vast majority, if puberty runs its course, will come to terms with their bodies. This is a case in which an inner sense of identity and an outer sense and the outer realities of a body don't match. And one of the things that puberty does is align those things up. I don't know if you remember puberty, Maria, but it's awkward. It's various degrees of just like nobody wants to go through that again. But
ugly duckling situation. Yes.
Well, it is. And it is to various degrees across the board. And some really, really struggle with this. And sometimes it persists, but it's vastly, vastly rare. And of course, the biggest misnomer here in all of this is that parents are pushed through this process with a threat. It's the suicide threat, which is, do you want a live son or a dead daughter? And by the way, that's the vast majority of the time, that's the way that myth goes, because we know that there has been this explosion of pre-adolescent and adolescent girls struggling with this kind of dysmorphia and wanting to transition. And that's also a big number of the detransitioners. And WPATH, which is this self-proclaimed group of experts on this, acknowledge that teenagers can't understand the long-term effects. So there's no such thing as informed consent on this. Like, I'm looking at this whole process, and I've just listed 5 areas where we have been misinformed, where lies have been told, and we were told the science is settled. And none of those things are true. It is happening, right? There is no such thing as informed consent. People do actually want to detransition. The treatments are permanent. This isn't a pause button. I mean, you just kind of go down the line and you're like, this is why the rest of the world has backed off of this, because it was a social experiment without any sort of strong scientific backing to it. It was a social experiment without any solid ground to stand on. And that is being exposed over and over and over. So I think Dr. Grossman is right. And we'll link to the Breakpoint Forum that we did with her and Dr. Steve Gersovich at the beginning of the year. And then more recently with Dr. Farr Curlin and Dr. James Cantor. These are all medical professionals, bioethicists, writing about this, and we have just been misinformed. So you drop this Stop the Harm database. It is very, very important what this is showing us. It is something. And hopefully this will be another source that gives us clarity on what is actually happening in this world.
I want to point out too that this other study has been getting some more attention this week in light of this news about the number of children that have been subject to this. There was a study in 2022 that was published in a journal called Sexual Medicine Reviews, and the study came out of Canada. It was a meta-analysis of, I think, 1,800 or so cases in which girls had undergone surgery to basically a transgender so-called plastic surgery. So they usually take skin or tissue from the forearm and then they create what appear to be male genitals, but they'll never function, obviously. And they found that the complication rate was 76%. 76% of girls who undergo this kind of surgery are going to have some sort of complication. There's going to be problems with the urethra, or there's going to be infections, or something physically dangerous is going to be the impact of this. I think that's really important, part of this discussion as well, because this false dichotomy, this really evil kind of thought experiment that's being presented to parents when they come in about, do you want a live son or dead daughter, whatever. This is now a unequivocal part of that conversation. So, you're not going to get an alive daughter. You're going to get an alive daughter with severe medical complications that are going to probably last the rest of her life or his life, whatever it would be. That has to be part of the discussion now. And hopefully with the more studies like this that come out, and unfortunately it's going to require more people to be subject to this intentional harm to create these studies. But the more they come out, the less ignorable the stats become. And I think one of the most important parts of the conversation now that we have to continue to beat this drum is that more and more people are going to come out and say, well, we didn't know. Doctors are going to say that. Hospital officials will say it. The media is already saying it. We didn't know. We were doing the best we could with the information we had at the time. We were trying to help as many people as possible. It is critically important that we do not let them say that, because, and it not out of like I want to win this argument, or I want history to smile on me and frown upon them. Not out of anything like that, but because we can't let this kind of thing happen again. We have to be prepared. Like, our trust in these certain institutions should be so low and so shattered in a way that will protect us from future sort of anti-science, anti-human movements like this. There was never a time when it was possible to make a boy a girl. And anyone who suggested that we suddenly in 2019, we didn't know that you couldn't do that, has to be shown that that's not the case. So that when somebody tries to make a claim like this moving forward about something else and whatever wildness it will be next time, we have to be able to say, no, we don't trust you anymore. You pretended you didn't know this before, but it's obviously borne out now. And you don't, yeah.
Yeah. Well, this goes all the way back to the first segment. And it's also, we have to bring in two things here. Like, well, first, this is when we talked about this illusion of control, we know it affected the sciences. That includes the medical sciences, right? This is why in the 20th century, you've had this kind of moving line between enhancement and control, birth control, in other words, not just trying to care for people in their fertility and in the process of procreation, but controlling procreation. And then that's just one part of it. I mean, where, this plastic surgery, which allows us to help people who have been harmed, now also leads to this ability to completely enhance, people. And that's, a big undercurrent here, combined with, you think, when that illusion of control combined with this definition of human dignity as being sexual autonomy, which comes from the other, a side direction of the sexual revolution. So when you combine this kind of modern impulse of control with the sexual revolution, then you get the idea that we actually can turn boys into girls. And you mentioned the complications in this, creation, so to speak, of, male appearing genitalia. The complications the other direction are even worse, because you're actually creating a wound that will never heal. And I don't want to be gross or anything like that, but it's kind of like when we have the conversation about abortion. At some level, at some point, you got to go, what are we actually talking about here? And to know that that kind of surgery, removing healthy organs or basically, fabricating fake ones, took place in 6,000 cases on minors, which is what this report comes out with. Now we're talking about a real number of victims. Not to repeat what we say here a lot, but ideas have consequences and bad ideas have victims. And the bad ideas of the sexual revolution combined with the bad ideas of this modern illusion of control can have victims. The bigger the idea, the bigger the victims. And we're talking about big ideas about what it means to be human, male and female. Now, goes back to how can we suffer well? And one of the conversations that emerged the other night with Joni is that Christians will be known not just by how they suffer, but also how they care for the suffering. This is the helpers that lined up around Western North Carolina. And we're going to have to be the helpers that line up around this very vulnerable population. And we'll take shots for it. But I mean, what we now know is It's the lives of children that are on the line. Of course, we knew that already, but now we actually have the data to back it up.
But I want us to be bold too in saying, especially in light of these complications, which makes sense. I mean, yeah, anytime you mutilate a body, there's going to be complications. This kind of surgery should not be happening to anybody, minor or not. Certainly not minors. And, woe to those who fail to protect the most vulnerable. That's a biblical concept for sure. And we should be protecting kids at all costs, but nobody should be subjected to this kind of thing. And that should be a part of, our work in this area going forward too. And, obviously there's an arena to talk about the political strategy with this sort of thing. But from a worldview perspective, no man or boy can become a girl or a woman, regardless of whatever age you are. And nobody should be suggested to that kind of delusion. And it's, again, I'm glad that Stop the Harm, the database, includes the amount of money being made on this, because that has to be a part of this conversation as well. That's just an obvious perverse incentive here. And it's worth knowing and pointing out. Let's move now to our time of recommendations. I will quickly just recommend that book I mentioned earlier in the first segment, The Case for Faith for Kids by Lee Strobel. There's all sorts of iterations of his Case for Christ, Case for God, Case for Faith. But this one's been really sweet. I just happened to see it on my pastor's bookshelf and I grabbed it and borrowed it without telling him, and I have been using it with my 8-year-old, and it's been very sweet because it's well written, but it also has a lot of good sections where it prompts questions. So like I said, it opened, talking about Hurricane Katrina. So it's a few years old, but it prompted her to kind of think about what sort of things have you seen that troubled you or made you question whether God is good or whatever. And we've had a lot of really sweet conversations. I think we're only like a chapter into it. So I highly recommend that if you have a kid who's asking those kinds of questions or you anticipating those coming soon.
Yeah, those are great books. All of his books, I think, the Case for, have been made into kids' versions. And we have the whole set, and we went through it with our kids as well. So 2 thumbs up. Also, by the way, J. Warner Wallace's Cold Case Christianity has been turned into for kids. And so these are the best resources I know of for 7, 8, 9-year-old kids to start thinking about these kinds of things. And they can think about these kinds of things. And you can start to make the connection, I think, between their faith and reality. So, it's really easy to develop bifurcation. It's like we go to church on Sunday and then the rest of my life here. This is a way to start helping them think about everything from a Christian perspective. So yeah, 2 thumbs up on those. I recommend your recommendation. And so I'll leave it at that, other than to say, I've already recommended the conversation that I was privileged to have with Joni, Eareckson, Tada this week. The video should be posted pretty quickly. I don't know if it's up yet on the Lighthouse Voices site. This is a joint event that the Colson Center does with Focus on the Family. It's live in a particular location. We've done it in Michigan and Colorado and in California and other places. And the next one coming up is November the 12th with the one and only Os Guinness, talking about, really how Christians can lead a new sexual revolution. So very apropos of what we've been talking about as well. These are conversations on the intersection of family, Focus on the Family, and culture, the Colson Center, and kind of how we can think about these things together. So check out that wonderful conversation with Joni, Eareckson, Tada, and sign up to join us either live if you're in the Colorado Springs area, or you can join the live stream, and that is November the 12th, Tuesday night. The week after the election, well, we will all need to have some clarity on the future of the civilization.
Can we have a Lighthouse Voices event in Hawaii next time? And I will host that one. I'll sign up for that one. Very nice of you to say. Thanks. All right. Well, that's going to do it for our show today. Thanks so much for listening, as always, to Breakpoint This Week. From the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, I'm Maria Baer, alongside John Stonestreet. Head over to breakpoint.org for links to the stories we talked about today, as well as our recommendations and other commentaries and resources. Otherwise, we'll see you all back here next week. God bless.